Дорогие друзья, сегодня мы в очень красивом, необычном месте, где каждый камень говорит, и за каждым камнем прячется история. Кроме того, с нами сегодня будет эксперт. Hi Mark, how are you?
Hello Anna, I'm fine. And you?
Yeah, I'm very well. We are in a very beautiful place.
It's slightly windy.
Slightly windy, yeah. Sometimes sunshine comes, but not always. But anyway, thank you for coming. I know you are very busy, and I really appreciate your time. And I'm going to ask you 5 questions, but you can take your time and tell me more if you wish. I noticed you like to be on cemeteries, and
Yes.
you're very interested about cemetery. And could you tell me a bit about yourself and why?
Okay, I'll try and keep this story short. I am from Belfast. I studied as an engineer in university, in Queen's University, and I worked all Ireland for many years, for decades. And I made it a little project as I was working as an engineer to visit the ancient sites of Ireland.
I
In
see.
particular, to visit all of the ancient high crosses,
Wow.
which made my journeys. I was away from my family a lot for many days, traveling long distances, and this turned it into an adventure and drew me into our fascinating history.
Yeah, so it started roughly how many years ago, like just to see how...
I'd say at least 30.
Wow.
At least 30 years ago.
Yeah, this is...
And my love for ancient Ireland, and although I'm not religious, my love for these ancient crosses and the more modern reproductions like we have here has grown and grown as my fascination has grown in that subject.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting, but were you born in Belfast?
Yes.
You
I was
were
born in
Belfast.
Belfast, and I will probably die in Belfast. But a few times I've thought of leaving. I could have had a job in Canada, considered Australia. In the end, I stayed here. But because Belfast is a city transformed, I'm very happy for my wife, myself, and our children to still be in Belfast. It brings people from all over the world, like from Russia, for instance, Anna,
Yeah,
to live
absolutely. Yeah. So please tell me where we are. I want you to tell our viewers.
Yes, where we are now is Belfast City Cemetery. This cemetery was opened in August 1869, and it was opened as a matter of urgency. Belfast had been a small town. It had been growing very rapidly. It had been developing its industry, particularly linen, and then following that, shipbuilding, for which it is most famous because we constructed the Titanic. So Belfast was going very fast. There were only some small old churches with graveyards. They were full. So urgently the city needed a large new cemetery. And this place then, this site was bought and it was developed. It was laid out as a parkland. A very genteel cemetery. As you can see, it is a very green and beautiful place, and what makes it particularly interesting then, it is full of unique memorials, and I love the aesthetics of them, the appearance, the design, but also when I look into them a little further, I find out the stories of the people who lie beneath.
Yeah, that's the main fascination, I guess, about cemeteries. Behind every gravestone there is a hidden story, and
yes,
so I hope to hear a few today.
Yes, a cemetery, a graveyard, it is a storybook of a very different kind.
Yeah. And tell me please about Celtic crosses. There is one just behind us.
Yes, okay. The ancient high crosses of Ireland, or the Celtic crosses as they're typically known, they stood abandoned and forgotten for at least 700 years. Very evocative in the countryside, in little forgotten places, and it wasn't until the 1850s that people became generally in society aware of this wonderful art that existed in Ireland. Now we have just one man to thank for that. He was a man called Henry O'Neill. He was a very talented artist. He could have made a very successful living drawing portraits. He could draw portraits so good they were nearly photographic in quality. But Henry O'Neill had an obsession, maybe a bit like me, with the ancient history of Ireland and the ancient monuments. And he went around Ireland drawing these. Now he researched the crosses, which particularly drew him with engineering precision. He measured them, he took rubbings from them, he did little trial drawings, and eventually he produced wonderful, wonderful illustrations, which he published in a book in 1857, and this opened the eyes of society to this wondrous art form. Now that was his promotion of this part of our history was so successful that it became a fashion to have gravestones and memorials made like Celtic crosses. Now these crosses, some of them they very closely copied the originals, others they varied it, others it was just used as an inspiration for new forms of art. Now Henry O'Neill, he visited Belfast in 1855. He gave a lecture with illustrations on the ancient high crosses of Ireland, and at that lecture was a man called the Reverend John Scott Porter, and this is his memorial. So he was a reverend in the Presbyterian Church, Rosemary Street, one of our oldest churches, and he was fascinated in many things in life, including old Irish culture, language, and the ways that it was expressed. And he heaped praise on Henry O'Neill for the beautiful quality of his artwork and encouraged him to do more. And he was so impressed by Henry O'Neill's artwork that it inspired his own memorial. So this memorial is in the shape of an ancient high cross that stands at Drumcliff in County Sligo in the far west of Ireland. In fact, in the graveyard where William Butler Yeats, the famous Irish poet, is buried by coincidence. So Reverend Scott Porter, he then directly used one of the illustrations from Henry O'Neill's books then, and it was used then to create his own memorial. And so this is not an exact copy, but certainly the shape of it is the same, and he has changed the detailing. And of course, it is enormous. It must be 4 meters tall, possibly the size of the original, I'm imagining as well. So that achievement of Henry O'Neill is to bring back, as I said, after 700 years these crosses been forgotten, only known about locally. He brought it to dominance in society, and this caught on not only in Ireland but across the world where there was any sort of Irish or Celtic connection, or indeed Scottish connection, because there's strong cultural links between Ireland and Scotland as well has some of these magnificent ancient crosses.
Yeah, sure. And how many of them here Celtic crosses?
In
Not
Ireland?
many. No, I mean on this cemetery.
In this cemetery, there are a lot. There are a lot, but they are interspersed with many other types of memorials. For the most in the world, you would need to go to the largest cemetery in Ireland, the Glasnevin in Dublin.
Yeah,
and it has
that.
an enormous amount
Beautiful.
of Celtic crosses, and also that cemetery has the grave of Henry O'Neill. Now, what is particularly interesting and poignant about Henry O'Neill is that he died in poverty. He was not successful commercially, and his grave had nothing on it for 136 years.
Wow.
A very good historian called Peter Harbison, Irish historian, he published a book on the life of Henry O'Neill, and this brought to prominence the injustice that this man, who was buried in the cemetery with the most Celtic crosses in the world, had no memorial. So people donated money, and there's now a modest Celtic cross made of local stone on his grave.
Oh,
so that is has righted an injustice.
Yeah. Mark, please tell me, what is it behind you?
Okay, this is one of the largest memorials. Indeed, it is the largest memorial in Belfast City Cemetery, and it is known as the Gallahher Steps, and it is named after a man called Thomas Gallahher, who is possibly one of the largest mass murderers in history.
Wow.
The reason for that is that he ran the largest tobacco factory in the world, making cigarettes, which of course are very bad for your health. So that is a little joke, maybe a little macabre joke. So this memorial was in a very poor state. The weather and vandalism had reduced it, and it looked terrible. But this whole cemetery is being refurbished, and these Gallahher steps have been beautifully restored. And hopefully soon they will take down this fence when the work is complete. So Thomas Galлахер is one of many people buried in here. They're named for him, but also Edward Harland, who founded the company Harland and Wulf, the largest shipyard in the world. He is also buried in here. But that is just an aside. Thomas Galлахер, from his enormous factory, which produced, let me see, there were more than 4,000 people employed in it, and these cigarettes that he made were exported all over the world, and many of them went to America. And whenever people bought them, they had a little card in them, like a card that you could collect, and they were scenes of Ireland, and there were hundreds of different types. They're a very collectible artifact now. This is the early 1900s, and many of those had illustrations of the ancient high crosses of Ireland. So Thomas Galлахер, he, as well as Henry O'Neill, who I've already mentioned, he helped to promote the ancient high crosses of Ireland to the world. And indeed, many of the finest Gaelic revival Celtic crosses in the world are in the east coast of America, of Irish Americans, American people with strong connections to Ireland. Okay, this cross is a memorial to a man called John Kierker, and I've already mentioned Belfast creating its wealth through the linen industry and shipbuilding. Belfast, along with Dublin, also made great wealth from distilling whisky. And John Kierker was one of the major whisky blenders in Belfast, and his warehouse actually still stands on Academy Street in Belfast. Now, John Kierker obviously was inspired, as the Reverend Porter, to have a Celtic cross on his grave, and this one is inspired by the Monaster Boyce crosses. So about halfway between Belfast and Dublin, there's a small graveyard with two of what I would say are the most magnificent of all of the high crosses in Ireland, and this copies the form of the taller of the two, which is the tallest in Ireland, nearly 7.5 meters tall, the original one. So this then it is inspired by the design of these ones at this place called Monaster Boyce. So this actual cross itself, it is made of very good quality limestone. You can actually see the little fossils in it, and it is made of 3 pieces. And this illustrates the basic design of most of the great high crosses. Firstly, it has an enormous base on it, which is useful for our inscriptions. Then the shaft and arms of the cross is all one piece of stone, and then we have a little capstone on top. So the shape of the cross is a subject of some debate. Why is it a cross with a circle?
I wanted to ask you.
Yes. So there are many theories of it, and one of them is that the ancient pre-Christian symbol in Ireland was a circle, and that whenever Christianity came to Ireland, as in many other places, it absorbed the local culture into its own new traditions, and then hence that the circle was incorporated with the cross. As an engineer, I also recognize that having the circle gives greater structural strength to the arms of the cross.
Sure, yeah.
Without the circle, then it would have less support, and possibly some of the ancient crosses would have been weathered and weakened and broken. So it actually performs a useful function, as well as, of course, giving a beautiful and unique aesthetic to the cross as well. So another aspect of the cross is actually the little piece on top, which is like a roof, and that is intentional, and sometimes it takes the shape of a little building with a roof, which is an imitation of the ancient churches of Ireland. Some of them, it is very close to being the actual dimensions of the very earliest stone churches in Ireland. And this cross then is, it is noticeable as well that there's lots of grass in front. Now, this cemetery is nearly full, and there are graves everywhere, not graves on this patch. This is a rich man who bought all of this land so that the memorial to him and his family could stand magnificently on its own without being crowded in by other graves and other memorials. So that in itself, if you see an area of grass, open grass, in the part of the cemetery where the rich people are buried, that is a particularly rich man.
Mark, these crosses behind us look very, very different, I would say, from other Celtic crosses. Is it also called Celtic? Of course
yes,
it is, yeah,
well,
but...
the crosses, actually, it's a good question, Anna. They weren't known as Celtic. It's pronounced with a hard C. They weren't known as Celtic crosses really until modern times. They were known just as high crosses. This one is very different, yes. And this is a copy, a reproduction of an ancient Scottish cross slab. So this culture was shared between Ireland and Scotland in the early Christian era, and some of the earliest stones were a bit like a prototype for a high cross. They were just carved as this one was in the stone. And the original stone, which is actually quite a bit larger than this, is at a place called Aberlemno in Scotland. And that one dates from, there's a debate about how old it is, but it is at least 1200 years old. And this is rather a lovely little simplified copy of it. So this stone then commemorates a man with the magnificent name of Luke Livingstone Macassi.
Oh, I see.
Nice name, nice name. And his wife is buried with him as well. And he was a very intelligent man. He trained in the legal profession, but he was also an engineer. And he specialised, a great special interest of his was in water supply. I had mentioned that Belfast had problems in the Victorian era with having enough places to bury people, but there was another problem, enough water supply. Belfast had a very poor water supply, and this man, Luke Livingstone Macassi, he worked for most of his career helping to address that. And it was him who identified a very good source of water for Belfast in the Mourne Mountains, the glorious Mourne Mountains to the south of here, and he proposed that reservoirs could be built and that water could be piped to Belfast, a distance of certainly more than 30 kilometres.
Silent Valley.
From Silent Valley and other reservoirs. It's a magnificent place, and his idea was to build reservoirs. This wasn't fully realised until long after he was dead. But he then made a very important contribution to the development of the city of Belfast. Another very curious project that he worked on, which never came to fruition, was the development of a tunnel, a railway tunnel to connect Ireland to Scotland. And that was, and he produced a report on 4 possible routes, and this has been looked at and talked about for a couple of 100 years, and quite recently it was talked about by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson. He proposed looking at this once more, but as was predicted from the start, it's not going to happen. I was not surprised. It would cost so much money in the modern world.
I heard about the bridge,
Yes, he also proposed an even more impractical bridge, but none of this will happen. I don't think, with the changing politics, the geopolitics of Europe, I don't think it is practical that there will ever be a connection between this northern part of Ireland and Scotland. Though I would love there to be a tunnel there with a railway, because then it would be a lot easier to visit my cousins in Scotland. You can see that this is a very different Celtic cross from the ones that we have looked at so far, and this is a memorial to a man called Adam Alexander Laughlin, and he lived in Florenceville, an old house that still stands close to where I live. And if you look at the memorial, you will see on it the detailing on the head of the cross. It is covered with, it is festooned with passion flowers, which is quite common on memorials, but in this case it is on a Celtic cross. And a lovely touch, there's a few of the flowers have actually fallen off and are sitting below. Another thing that's very interesting, and it's a clue to the profession of the man who lies beneath, is there's an anchor incorporated in the design. So he had something to do with the sea. Not only him, but his father as well, who was Alexander Laughlin, also lies here. His father was a surgeon in the Royal Navy. But Adam Alexander McLaughlin, his son, he was a captain, as it says in the memorial, late captain Indus steam flotilla. And that suddenly opens up another world of discovery. This was part of the British Empire, the Indus River in India. It is now in Pakistan. And as Britain conquered the continent, the subcontinent of India, one of the main routes in was the Indus River. They used enormous steamboats with paddles at the side, which had a very shallow draft, and they actually travelled up this river nearly 1,000 miles. If you follow that river to its conclusion, which you couldn't in one of those steamboats, you would get to the Himalayas and Mount Everest. So this man, he worked in developing the British Empire in India as well, and he retired to Belfast, and eventually whenever he died, he was buried here in Belfast City Cemetery.
So Mark, another discovery. Thank you for taking me here. Very unusual cross, lots of decoration. Could you tell me the story of this, please?
Yes, it's a lovely smaller cross, this, and this is a memorial to a man. He worked in a legal profession. He was called John Greg Shaw, and it's quite poignant that he died in 1892. And on the memorial also was commemorated his son, who was also called John, who died in 1885. And also within a few years of his death in 1901, his daughter, his young daughter Catherine, was also buried here. So it shows that even rich people were not immune to losing their children in youth. This was very common in that era, and it was no respecter of the class divisions in society. But the cross itself is particularly beautiful, and it would have been a unique design, possibly selected by his widow. And in it we can see some of the elements that make a Celtic cross particularly special, beyond the basic shape. And on this we can see on the edge there's what is known as rope moulding, like twisted rope all around it, which helps to accentuate the shape. We also have different panels, then we have interlace. Within the shape of the cross itself, you can see the Celtic interlace, and then there are separate panels with different designs. But what I particularly like are these protrusions in the shape of the cross, and they're bosses. And of them, the designs I like best are the one in the centre, which has got a swirl in it, and below it, the lovely one with the flower.
Yeah.
And another thing,
great.
Anna, you have a young daughter. You should bring her back here with a few blank sheets of paper and some coloured crayons, and get her to put the page over that panel with the swirls in the middle, and to do a rubbing of it. It produces a lovely, lovely
What
design.
a wonderful idea. Yeah. I like this magnificent cross.
Yes, it is particularly special, Anna, for many reasons. So this cross is actually a war memorial. It was put up after the Great War in memory of a man called Edward Workman, and he had gone to fight in France, and he died of injuries that he sustained in war, and he is buried here. So this is a memorial to him, put up by his parents, Frank and Sarah Workman. Now what makes him particularly notable is his father, Frank Workman, along with a man called George Clark, who also has a Celtic cross nearby. They broke away from Hарлand and Wulf shipyard, and they set up their own shipyard, Workman Clark. And that shipyard sometimes produced a greater output than Hарлand and Wulf. So Belfast at one time had the two largest shipyards in the world. And Frank Workman's son, Edward, actually was a director of the company, and he was working there. But even though there was no need for him to do so, there was no conscription in Ireland. He volunteered, like many, in fact hundreds of thousands of Irish, predominantly men, to take part in the Great War. And he died then, and he was buried here and was sadly missed by his family and of course the people he worked with. Now this cross, it started my interest in the cemeteries, because I saw this in a presentation, and the man who was giving it, Nigel, he said this, he thinks it was a copy of one of the ancient crosses of Ireland. And I at the end of the talk I said, yes Nigel, you're absolutely correct. This is a copy of a cross from County Tipperary in the far south of Ireland. It's a very good copy of one of the most ancient and celebrated of the high crosses of Ireland. So there are many things that make this cross special, and one of them, like with John Kierkegaard, is we're standing in a beautiful open green area in front of the cross.
Fabulous.
That is expensive land. They have bought that land so no one else could cover it, so that then this cross has a beautiful setting with all of the green in front, and of course this magnificent tree in its all of its finery of early summer as well. So the cross is a very faithful copy of this original cross, and this then was inspired by the illustrations of Henry O'Neill, who we mentioned earlier. Now the cross itself, there are a few particularly unique elements to it. One of them is its orientation. All of the other ones are orientated to face towards the roads. This one is not. It is at an angle. And there's one particular reason for that. If you look that way, Anna, this cross faces towards the shipyards.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So this cross was positioned to look towards the place where the family made their wealth and fame. But also, interestingly then, this means that this cross faces east. And east is the direction that all of the ancient high crosses faced, to face the rising sun, and as Christian symbols to face towards Jerusalem. So
that's beautiful.
So that is unusual from a few aspects in that regard. And there's another, to my mind, or to my knowledge, completely unique aspect to this cross that is not obvious whatsoever. It looks like it is made from limestone, which to some extent it is, but the cross is actually made from metal. It was made from, the basic structure was made from metal, a very special cement, lime cement was made, and it was covered in that. And when that's set, then the sculptors carved the cross.
Is it about this particular cross, or
this
pretty much
to my
all of
knowledge
them?
This is unique. So I think this cross, although it is hidden now underneath the cement, this cross, I think, I have no evidence, but I would be pretty certain that it would be made in the shipyard where Edward Workman actually was employed. And we can prove it as well, because I'm going to go up to the cross and tap it, and you will hear. That will be evidence.
Great. I noticed there are people who like cemeteries, they find it very peaceful, but there are others who can't just be at cemeteries. They try never approach. I know who you are, which category, you don't need to say that, but I wonder, what do you enjoy? I mean, why do you enjoy to be here? Because I know for you it's a place not only to tell stories, but it's a place for a nice walk, and so just explain how you feel.
A good question. Cemeteries are peaceful places apart from the busy life in the city. So when you go in here, you're in a place of peace where you can contemplate life and indeed death. And this is a lovely parkland setting that is full of stories and beautiful memorials. And whenever, if you're interested in the past and our history, the more you look, the more you find. So this is a storybook that you're opening, and you're disappearing into another world. And what is particularly nice is this is a way to remember people who would otherwise be forgotten. If you come here, you can read the memorials and get a little bit of their story, maybe look a bit further as well. So this is an important place to remember the past and to remember people who have affected our lives. And as many of the rich people, the industrialists, the architects, the people who developed Belfast are buried in here as well. In this cemetery is the story of Belfast.
Wonderful. I like the idea of storybook.
Yes.
Sounds great.
Storybook in stone.
So hopefully you enjoyed our story from a beautiful storybook called Belfast City Cemetery. Я очень надеюсь, что вам было с нами интересно. и что вы обязательно приедете в Белфаст, чтобы увидеть все своими глазами. С вами была Анна на моем канале Island by Anna.